Hamas, we know, has all sorts of different military capabilities that we have not yet really seen used at scale in the Gaza Strip. And one can speculate the reason why that is the case is because they are waiting for the Israelis to get deeper into Gaza City itself. So some of the capabilities that come to mind are some of their anti-tank platforms and weapon systems. So we know, for instance, that Hamas has access to a device called an explosively formed penetrator, an EFP, which is this extraordinarily interesting invention of Iranian design. The Iranians have actually developed them and proliferated them throughout Iraq over the years, where there are client militias in Iraq. Iranian proxies and partner militias operating throughout Iraq have used these EFPs extensively against American service members. They are responsible for killing, I'm not even sure exactly how many American soldiers at this point, right? And so we've seen EFPs pop up in the Gaza Strip previously. This is just one capability among many that Hamas can begin to use to hit a lot of the Israeli armored units that are now progressing through the Gaza Strip.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're looking at the latest in the Israel-Hamas conflict. I'm delighted to be joined by Nicholas Carl, the Middle East Portfolio Manager for the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specialises in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us. And also Brian Carter, the Salafi Jihadism Team Lead and an analyst for the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. He specialises in Iraq, Syria and Yemen, and also Islamic movements. Brian, thank you so much for joining us as well on Frontline today.
Happy to be here.
Nicholas, just to start with you, can you bring us up to speed with the very latest in particularly Gaza City? We know that Israel is continuing to carry out aerial bombardments, but also some tanks approaching the area around the Al-Quds hospital. What is the latest?
Yeah, that's essentially what it is that we are seeing, right? The Israeli forces have been operating in the Gaza Strip now for a couple of days, all in alignment with the stated Israeli objective of trying to completely destroy Hamas, so particularly destroying its government and military capabilities. To that end, we are seeing Israeli forces begin to advance through the Gaza Strip, both coming from the northern side as well as to this more central axis to the south of Gaza City. We're seeing a lot of intense fighting going on right there as different Palestinian militias will conduct all sorts of hit-and-run style attacks against Israeli forces. It's important to note in this context that what Israel is trying to do right now is a clearing operation, the purpose of which is to go in and to hit the enemy, but not actually assert control over the territory. This is an important distinction because we're seeing a lot of people frame it as if Israel now controls certain segments of the Gaza Strip, but that is just plainly not the case, right? And that's in part demonstrated by the fact that we are continuing to see Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups conduct attacks behind the Israeli forward line of advance, again, because of the fact that they don't yet control these territories. They're advancing through, approaching Gaza City. And once they get there, that's when we expect to see a lot more intense fighting erupt. That appears to be where Hamas and other Palestinian militias have really begun to harden a lot of their defensive measures and equipment to prepare for a big fight with the IDF.
And presumably, Brian, on their way to Gaza City, they're targeting key bits of strategic infrastructure operated by Hamas. We've heard recently that the IDF have had some success clearing a tunnel in the north of Gaza.
Yeah. So as the Israeli Defense Forces have been moving through the Gaza Strip, they have been targeting Hamas infrastructure. So we often see them reporting out, the IDF reporting out that they are clearing tunnels, particularly in the northeast in Beit Hanun. But this activity is going on elsewhere as well. They're also disrupting Hamas rocket launching sites and their mortars as well.
And they've actually released footage of them clearing, or certainly beginning to clear this tunnel. What does it show, Brian?
Yeah, so the footage that the Israeli forces tend to release shows the Israeli forces around the entrances to these tunnels. They usually don't show them on the inside. Of course, the IDF continues to report out that they are destroying these tunnels as they find them.
And Nicholas, how difficult is it for the IDF to identify these tunnels in the first place? How well will they know where they are positionally?
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily difficult undertaking. Western media had some days or weeks ago put out a map of all of the known tunnel infrastructure that stretches throughout the Gaza Strip. There's just hundreds of kilometers worth of tunnel infrastructure there. But despite there being so much, figuring out exactly where this stuff is can be extraordinarily difficult. The most recent information the Western media has published is from 2014, right? Meaning that we're operating on data that is, almost a decade old now at this point. Now, the IDF may have more up-to-date information on where this tunnel infrastructure is, but the bottom line is that it is throughout the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and it allows these Hamas fighters to rapidly maneuver throughout the battle space and facilitate the transfer of their fighters, their equipment. And so not only is then finding these tunnels a pain, but then actually going through them, clearing them out, right? It's just an absolute nightmare that's compounding the already extraordinarily difficult challenge of conducting an intense urban fight. So this is really just a monumental challenge that the Israelis are presently facing, and the tunnels are just one element of that.
Brian?
Yeah. Yeah. And to add to that, to pull in a little bit of context from 2014, one of the things, 2014 being the last Israeli ground operation within the Gaza Strip, one of the things that the IDF had quite a bit of difficulty with was actually finding those tunnels. And they've experimented with a variety of different systems to help them do that. None of them have been particularly effective 100% of the time. So a lot of the focus has been on airstrikes knocking out these tunnels from the Western media. However, what we see on the ground is a process from Israeli infantry going into urban areas and searching for finding these tunnels and then either clearing them or destroying them.
There might be some people thinking, Nicholas, how did Hamas build up this network of tunnels? Did Israel notice? When were they first aware of them? What can you say on that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when the Israelis, of course, first became aware of the construction of the tunnels, but this is something that Hamas has been doing now for years, if not decades, right? And they've been doing it for the explicit purpose of allowing themselves, again, to sort of operate throughout the Gaza Strip in a sort of camouflaged way that makes it that much harder for the IDF to identify and then target any sensitive Hamas personnel or sites. And so it is through these tunnels that the Hamas fighters keep a lot of their their munitions, their sensitive equipment, their key personnel and leaders, right? And so Mohammed Deif, who is a name that may become increasingly prevalent within the Western media space over the next couple of days. He's the military commander of Hamas, right? And he has been one of the key architects responsible for the construction and development of these tunnels. I don't think it was his idea initially, but he has played a very critical role in continually expanding them. And so, this is, again, all part of a very coherent concept and theory that he and other Hamas military leadership has worked out over the past couple of decades, thinking this is going to be something that really presents the Israelis with an immense challenge. It's the exact challenge they presently face. So, again, part of the idea here is to be able to harden their defenses and give Israel a real headache in the Gaza Strip. It also helps them when it is that they are trying to rapidly move all of their sorts of military equipment throughout Gaza so they can rapidly conduct attacks into Israeli territory itself. As a brief aside, these tunnels are one avenue through which Hamas fighters have been able to infiltrate into Israeli territory in the past, right? So it has both offensive and defensive utility in that regard.
And how big are they, Brian? Do we know? If they're keeping munitions down there, they must be at least reasonably big.
Yeah, I am not quite sure on the exact sizes of a lot of these tunnels. However, some of the diagrams that I've seen either published by the Western media or by the Israelis themselves show tunnels that individuals can actually walk around in. In fact, in 2014, when the Israelis were clearing some of these tunnels, what they actually found were munitions, motorcycles, items such as this that the Hamas fighters in 2014 had, of course, used to infiltrate into Israel. I'm sure they also used these tunnels again in a similar fashion when they infiltrated Israel on October the 7th.
And Nicholas, one of the things we hear from the Israelis is that Hamas uses key bits of civilian infrastructure to disguise these tunnels and to mask these tunnels. In particular, one of the justifications for the fighting around the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City is the idea that there may be a tunneling network underneath, and that might be being used by Hamas. Is there much evidence to support that?
So, right, I mean, the Biden administration has come out and noted similarly that Hamas has developed a lot of its military infrastructure in aliens where there, or in areas where there's just a lot of civilian activity, right? And so it presents just an additional layer to this dilemma that the Israelis face, because now they have to think about how it is that they are going to strike precisely at the military targets without endangering civilians, right? That's an extraordinarily difficult and complex challenge for any military, right? And so, the Israelis, of course, need to pay very close attention to that. And that's, partly, I think, the theory that has guided Hamas to build out its military infrastructure in the way that it does. On this point of the hospitals, right? There's Al Shifa Hospital, which is one of the most prominent in the Gaza Strip. It is also allegedly, according to the Israelis, a location under which Hamas has an extensive headquarters and other sort of tunnel infrastructure that it uses to control its entire movement. So, right, Israel needs to begin to figure out how it is that it's going to be able to target this military hardware and this infrastructure without endangering civilians. It just makes the problem all that much harder.
Brian, would you agree with that?
Yeah, Nick is spot on. This is an incredibly complex task for any military. And of course, all militaries, the Israelis included, really need to pay close attention in their adherence to the laws of armed conflict.
Let's talk about how Hamas is responding to the ground invasion. There have been reports of hit and run attacks against Israeli forces in the north. Just talk me through, Brian, what a hit and run attack would look like.
Yeah, sure. So I can talk a little bit about what Hamas is actually doing, especially in the north, where we actually have the most evidence for what their plans look like and what their objectives are. So I'll start it out by noting a couple of days ago, we had a Western news media report citing two sources close to Hamas leadership that noted that Hamas is actually preparing for a prolonged war. And part of this effort that we're seeing in the north is we're describing it as a screening effort for a main defense that Hamas has staged in central Gaza City. The reason that we believe that this is a screening effort is because what Hamas is doing is, to your point, these hit and run attacks. So these look like basically Hamas fighters using their anti-tank missiles, using small arms, and using the tunnels in the urban environment to pop up and quickly and swiftly move away from becoming and avoiding becoming decisively engaged with Israeli military forces and getting themselves into a sort of pitched battle where the Israelis could easily defeat them.
So, Nicholas, that is the main logic, is it? That if you had a full-on conflict where you dig in, the Israelis are going to win. If you pop up using this tunneling network, if you have these hit-and-run attacks, that favors Hamas.
Yeah, not only that, but they also recognize that, of course, the Israelis are going to bring to bear certain advantages in this fight that, Hamas and the other Palestinian militias just are not going to have at their disposal, right? So Hamas is trying to play to its advantages. It's trying to, again, as I said earlier, present the Israelis with just a horrible dilemma in which they need to go into some of the most densely populated areas of Gaza City, do hard urban fighting, where Hamas assuredly is going to use all sorts of different traps and weapons at its disposal to impose a real casualty count on the Israelis. Hamas, we know, has all sorts of different military capabilities that we have not yet really seen used at scale in the Gaza Strip. And, one can speculate the reason why that is the case is because they are waiting for the Israelis to get deeper into Gaza City itself. So, some of the capabilities that come to mind are some of their anti-tank platforms and weapon systems. So we know, for instance, that Hamas has access to a device called an explosively formed penetrator, an EFP, which is this extraordinarily interesting invention of Iranian design. The Iranians have actually developed them and proliferated them throughout Iraq over the years, where there are client militias in Iraq. Iranian proxies and partner militias operating throughout Iraq have used these EFPs extensively against American service members. They are responsible for killing, I'm not even sure exactly how many American soldiers at this point, right? And so we've seen EFPs pop up in the Gaza Strip previously. This is just one capability among many that Hamas can begin to use to hit a lot of the Israeli armored units that are now progressing through the Gaza Strip. So there's that. And we expect, again, this to be really the main effort, the main defensive effort on behalf of Hamas.
And presumably those traps you referenced, Nicholas, could also be applied to the tunneling network as well.
The tunneling network, yes, of course. And again, keeping in mind, too, there's a lot of civilian infrastructure around the area. And so Hamas has been conducting a whole bunch of different information campaigns that the Iranians themselves have been supporting to achieve a couple of different effects, right? They've been trying to falsely claim or exaggerate the military defeats that Israel may be suffering in the Gaza Strip, trying to frame it as if Israel is not going to actually come through with this, while also trying to play up any civilian casualties that may have occurred. The idea here is to sort of create a political atmosphere internationally that imposes greater pressure on the Israeli political establishment and population to not really want to sustain a major ground operation into the Gaza Strip. That is, I think, at least in part, the theory of victory here for Hamas. They need to convince the Israelis that they don't want this fight, and that they want to try to eventually convince them to give up, I think, because that's really one of Hamas's main paths to survival now at this point.
Brian, would you agree? Is Hamas's strategy really to try and play the long game and through that sort of force Israel into a ceasefire?
Yes. And that's not only me agreeing, that's Hamas agreeing. That is what Hamas has publicly said in the two Western media sources, like I mentioned. Prolonging this conflict, they understand, and then their experience is that the longer this goes on, the greater the international pressure will become on Israel. And so to that end, they see prolonging the war as a way for them to experience success.
And I know that Hamas have called for other regional actors to step up their involvement in the conflict, in particular Hezbollah. Nicholas, do you think that's likely?
So it depends exactly on what the question is, right? Hezbollah is already involved in some respects. We've seen Hezbollah conduct daily attacks against Israeli positions along the northern border area since the war began, right? But yes, to your point, Hamas is trying to get more regional actors involved, particularly Iran and something often referred to as the axis of resistance, which is this term that Iranian leaders use to describe their unconventional alliance system throughout the Middle East that's comprised of state, semi-state, and non-state actors. So this coalition, this axis of resistance, includes parties like Iran itself, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, and myriad other Iraqi, Syrian militias running throughout the region. And Hamas has been very vocal that it has some expectation that Hezbollah and other Axis-affiliated actors throughout the West Bank are going to join the fight against Israel. Now, so far, we haven't yet seen Hezbollah really unleash its full strength against the Israelis. Instead, they've had a relatively restrained approach. We assess that the reason for that is because they're trying to draw IDF attention and resources northward and sort of fix those units there, right? They're trying to stretch the IDF and keep some of its resources committed to the north so that it has less that it can throw at Hamas in the Gaza Strip. There's this whole question as to whether we're going to see this war evolve into a regional conflict, or whether we're going to see additional fronts open up against Israel. The point I would make on that end is that, we've seen the Iranians and their allies in the axis of resistance actually already facilitate the expansion of the war, right? We're seeing fighting happen or rather, we're seeing parties in Lebanon conduct attacks into Israel, particularly Hezbollah and other affiliated Palestinian militias. We've seen the Houthis conduct a number of attacks into Israeli territory. That's unprecedented. But the Houthis have advanced long-range missile and drone capabilities given to them by the Iranians for the explicit purpose of being able to threaten Israel. Right? The conundrum that the axis of resistance is presently trying to present to Israel is to say, look, you Israel face threats from every single cardinal direction. Right, everywhere you look, you're going to face some Iranian-affiliated militia that has the capabilities to conduct attacks into your territory. So whether it is we're going to see Hezbollah step up its intervention and conduct more dramatic actions, that remains to be seen. I think it's really going to boil down to how Iranian and Hezbollah leaders calculate the risk and opportunity here. Right, they of course remain very committed to trying to destroy the Israeli state. That's one of their most important grand strategic objectives within the Middle East. And, to be sure, if they see an opportunity along that regard, they may conduct some action. That doesn't necessarily mean they're about to embark in some crazy effort to destroy Israel, right? But if they see something that they can do to, erode or undermine the Israeli state or harm its capabilities, they may take that opportunity. That's speculation, of course, right? The flip side of it is the risk. They rely on Hamas to be part of this sort of multi-front coalition they've built up against the Israelis, right? It is one of the sort of parts of this broader picture that the Iranians and Hezbollah have tried to build out. So there are some risks associated with potentially losing that chess piece, so to speak, in this broader regional project meant to fight Israel.
And Brian, there have been some attacks on US bases. Just tell us about those, and are they likely to continue?
Yeah, so I'll start out by making the point that yes, these attacks are likely to continue. In fact, just on Sunday, I believe, or Saturday, the Katib Hezbollah, which is one of Iran's principal proxies in Iraq, threatened to continue attacks against U.S. forces and, in fact, also begin attacking U.S. regional interests if the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, visited Baghdad. Of course, Blinken did that on Sunday. And what we have seen over the last few weeks as these groups have attacked the U.S. forces is that, in fact, a lot of these attacks, according to Pentagon Pentagon sources, are aiming to kill. That was one of the points made in a recent Wall Street Journal article. And we've seen evidence of this. So last week, I believe a report came out that a drone actually penetrated a U.S. barracks. However, the drone did not detonate. Had it detonated, it would have killed and injured U.S. forces. The next day, we saw an airstrike against IRGC-affiliated militias in Syria. And of course, I believe yesterday evening, we saw another airstrike against IRGC-affiliated forces. So this pattern of attacks against U.S. forces is likely to continue. And it is fundamentally dangerous because they are using systems designed to kill and purposely targeting U.S. forces with them.
Nicholas?
Yeah, I'll just add on to everything Brian has said, right? There's a bit of irony here. One of the core messaging efforts that the Iranians have undertaken over the past couple of weeks has been to argue internationally, hey, look, if this war in Israel blows up into a regional conflict, if this expands, it's the fault of the United States and it's the fault of Israel. That argument doesn't really hold much weight, but it's especially noteworthy given the fact that it is Iran and the axis of resistance, right, that has facilitated the expansion of this conflict to Lebanon, the West Bank, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, right? It is these parties that are intentionally trying to spread it. And they're trying to demonstrate to the United States too, not just Israel. They're trying to message to Washington, look, we, the axis of resistance, have the capability and the willingness to turn this into a larger fight. The logic there being, hopefully, that from their perspective, it would discourage the Biden administration from continually providing military and political support to the Israelis here. So they're really trying to coerce us, or the United States, not just Israel here.
And Nicholas, do you think we can see individual acts of resistance spreading beyond even the Middle East? I mean, I know recently Brazilian police working with Mossad arrested Hezbollah operatives who they say were planning attacks on Jewish targets in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is unfortunately part of the reality that Iran and Hezbollah have worked to create for us. It wasn't surprising to me at all when I saw those news reports because, Hezbollah has invested for decades in trying to build out its covert infrastructure throughout Latin America, but not just that. Throughout North America, Europe, Africa, right? I mean, Hezbollah is a global actor in some respects. And it's not just Hezbollah. It's also the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. We see these actors operate covertly throughout the world. They've plotted attacks against American, Western, and other Israeli targets on a variety of occasions. So no, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that we're going to see this kind of activity abroad. It's extraordinarily concerning, of course, right? Because it means that this is a problem that is not just contained to the Middle East. This reflects, I think, another unfortunate reality that, we in the West need to increasingly come to terms with, which is that, Iran and the challenge it presents through its coalition of proxy and partner militias is not something that stays confined to the Middle East in the slightest, right? This is an issue that immediately intersects with China and Russia and all sorts of other problem sets. One of the best examples of this, of course, is the fact that Iran has been providing drones and other forms of military support to the Russians in their bloody invasion of Ukraine, right? It's just all part of this broader picture here in which this is not just something that stays confined to the region, and we need to be thinking about it accordingly, I think. This is, I think, something that a lot of people are a bit reticent to do. After so many decades of having Western attention focused on the Middle East, people are weary of talking about it. But the Middle East is not done with us. Of course, they still very much so remain interested in us.
And Brian, I just want to ask you about the Hamas leadership, because we had a statement from one of the spokespeople for the IDF recently saying that Hamas's leadership are dead men walking. What do we know about the key leaders? And is that an accurate statement, or is that just fighting talk from the IDF?
Yeah, I mean, so Nick touched on Mohammed Deif in the Gaza Strip. And yes, the Israelis are actively targeting this leadership network, right? So what we are seeing is pretty much every day, the Israelis will announce a new airstrike targeting a Hamas leader, and in fact, usually taking out that leader. So we have compiled, I mean, day after day after day, they're targeting these individuals in the Gaza Strip. Whether or not they'll go after the targets outside of the Gaza Strip or outside of Israel, the Gaza Strip and West Bank, I don't know. However, of course, there are other leaders that are elsewhere in the Middle East. Of course, I believe Ismail Haniya, based out of Doha, Qatar, is one of them. But, these individuals are not just confined to Gaza Strip and West Bank. They are all throughout the region.
And Nicholas, would you say that taking out the Hamas leadership is the most important strategic objective, or is it some of the infrastructure, for example, the tunneling network, that is more important?
Yeah, so I can't speak to exactly what the Israeli calculation is here, of course. They've been, I think, a little bit ambiguous in their stated objective, right? They've said that they just across the board seek to destroy Hamas's government and military capabilities. Of course, both are important in that regard. I mean, it is these military capabilities that allowed them to conduct their brutal attack into Israel on October 7th. But to Brian's point, there's a whole bunch of Hamas leadership that's based abroad. And it is oftentimes these guys who are going to Tehran or going to Damascus or Beirut, right, to meet with the Iranians or the Hezbollah leadership and things like that, to coordinate a lot of these operations and discuss how it is that they're going to wage a sustained fight against the Israelis. So, both are going to be critical in that regard to figure out how it is that Israel is going to be able to not only just degrade, but to defeat the Hamas threat that they face. And, of course, there's just a whole lot of complexity involved in trying to figure out how it is that they're going to fight such a challenge, given the fact that it is so supported by actors like Iran and Hezbollah. Hamas has military positions in Lebanon, for instance, right? This is not something that even is confined to the Gaza Strip in many respects.
Brian, we've touched on the civilian situation. Do you think that the Israeli military leadership is conscious they've maybe got a limited window to carry out some of these operations, because there appears to be a growing international sense that there needs to be some kind of, we had the G7 yesterday talking about a humanitarian pause, and indeed Israel saying they are doing some short humanitarian pauses to allow civilian aid into Gaza. But do you think there is a growing sense that they don't have that much time to act militarily?
I think the Israelis, based on what I have seen in the Israeli media, are conscious that they have a short string on this generally. I think that's especially true within the Israeli military. I've seen both in the Israeli media as well as in the Western media, Israeli military sources noting that, there is only there is a time constraint on this operation. I think they're conscious of that. And I think that, they're probably planning with that in mind. Nicholas?
And Hamas is conscious of this too, right? And that is exactly the, I think, calculation that's informing a lot of the fighting right now. We talked a little bit about how Hamas is preparing for a long fight a little bit earlier. One of the ways in which they've done that is by trying to meter how many rockets and missiles they're firing into Israel every single day, right? They've said this explicitly. They have thousands of missiles and rockets, and yet they're not unleashing all of them because they're trying to conserve them and ensure that they can fight a weeks or months long fight against the Israelis. Right, we're certainly going to see a lot of the Palestinian groups, the Axis of Resistance, Iran, all try to play to this as well. This is an advantage they hope to exploit.
And that's a really good point you make, Nicholas, about the fact that Hamas are still firing rockets into Israel. So much of the coverage, understandably, because of the civilian situation, which is desperate on the ground in Gaza, is focusing on Gaza. But of course, it is two-way.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I think a lot of people forget. It's very easy to get entirely focused on the Gaza Strip because this is the area in which we're seeing a lot of fighting, right? This is the area that all international attention is on right now as we observe Israeli efforts to dismantle Hamas. But we also need to keep in mind the fact that Hamas is conducting daily rocket attacks into Israeli territory from the Gaza Strip, and they're hitting not just military targets, right? Tel Aviv, for instance, has been under almost daily rocket fire. So these are civilian targets that are at risk here. As I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah is conducting all sorts of different attacks into northern Israel. We've seen some unidentified militias conduct rocket attacks from southwestern Syria into Israel. Of course, we've seen a whole bunch of different efforts from Hamas and like-minded Palestinian militias to stoke anti-Israel violence in the West Bank. Right, so this is really a fight that's already begun to spread throughout much of Israel. And then finally, actually keeping in mind too the fact that the Houthis have been conducting, or at least attempting to conduct attacks into southern Israel. Right, so this is already something that has threatened civilians across the entirety of the country.
I mean, there is so much we could discuss here. I could talk to you for hours. Just a couple of quick questions for each of you. Starting off with you, Brian. We had recently Volker Turk, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, saying that in his view, both sides in this conflict have already committed war crimes. Do you agree?
So I will just say that in terms of the humanitarian situation on the ground, what we've got is just a awful humanitarian situation. This is a war in a highly urban environment, intense, heavily dense area in terms of population. And to that end, I think that it's important to keep in mind how the individuals on the ground, the civilians, oftentimes in war, take the brunt of, the violence that is unleashed. And I commend the UN official for keeping that in mind, of course.
And Nicholas, just finally for you, what will you be looking out for in the next week or so in terms of the military situation on the ground?
The big thing to look for, I think, is going to be what kind of progress in fighting we see as Israel begins to advance into the heart of Gaza City. Right, up until this point, most of the Israeli advances through the Gaza Strip have been through farmland or small villages. Right, they haven't yet gotten to the heart of the problem. Speak metaphorically. Right, it is here in Gaza City where we're going to see some of the most bloody fighting here, and it's going to be something, as Brian began to mention, that imposes, unfortunately, a high toll on both not only the fighters but also the civilians. So that is, I think, the big thing to watch out for, especially as we begin to see Israeli forces work toward these areas in which there's a whole bunch of the tunnels that they've constructed, a whole lot of different command nodes that Hamas has set up. This is where I expect to see some of the worst fighting in this war. So that's the thing that I expect we'll probably begin to observe over the next week or couple of weeks. It's going to be something that I think, unfortunately, will stretch on for quite some time.
Nicholas Carl, Brian Carter, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.